Welcome to a transatlantic dialogue on carbon pricing and the energy transition. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. The U.S., over the decades, has found that its most proven path to success in addressing any global challenge is to unleash the power, vibrancy, and innovativeness of its private sector to adapt and to create new solutions, and to do so in tandem with our allies. As the United States seek to catalyze change using the tool of incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Union is rolling out a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Both actions are occurring as many nations and states within the U.S. have implemented carbon pricing. While these many actions aim at the same goal, one might question whether they reinforce or compete. Key questions could also include, could we achieve these goals, which achieves these goals most efficiently and in a manner that sparks the most innovation, and would a coordinated approach better achieve these outcomes? To help answer these questions, we're gathering this panel here today. The Wilson Center, through the Environmental Change and Security Program, ably led by Lauren Reese, is pleased to be a member of the Transatlantic Climate Bridge, or TCB, a consortium of climate and energy think tanks, consultancies, and NGOs working to inform climate policy making between Germany, the United States, and Canada. We're pleased to be hosting today's event as part of the TCB conference, and would also like to thank our consortium partners, in particular Adelphi, for their partnership. In addition to ECSP and WISC, today's event is sponsored by our Global Europe program and the Canada Institute. I want to take a moment to note that one of our panelists, Professor Rabe, a fellow Wolverine, has an article that we just published on the Wilson Center today that I would encourage you to look at on climate pricing being in its middle age, but we are all still young. We're pleased to be welcomed to the Wilson Center, our moderator for today's panel, Sarah Schoenhardt. As a reporter for E&E News, Sarah provides extensive coverage of climate and energy developments globally, with a focus on the international climate negotiations, finance, and how countries are approaching the transition to cleaner economies. She's been following the many facets of carbon pricing closely, and we're pleased to have her in the facilitator's chair for this discussion. I turn it to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. Thank you for the introduction. I am very excited to be here today with a great lineup of speakers. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'll turn it over to each of them for some remarks, and then we'll get into a conversation. So directly next to me, I have Barry Rabe, who's the Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. If you haven't read his paper, which I guess just has gone up this morning, so check it out. It delves into a lot of the detail behind the conversation we're going to have today. And then at the far end of the table, we have Dagmara Koska, who joins us from the EU delegation, where she oversees climate and energy policy and manages relations with the United States. So I think we're going to have some interesting insights on how the EU is looking at its carbon market. And then online, we have Jessica Green, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. She focuses on the politics of decarbonization, transnational private regulation, and the interactions between public and private regulation. And we also have Stefano De Clara, who's the head of the Secretariat at the International Carbon Action Partnership, and is going to talk to us about some of the growth of carbon markets in other countries around the world. So I will turn it over to you, Barry, to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. I'd just like to begin by thanking everyone involved at this event through the Wilson Center. And in particular, for me, this is a homecoming of sorts because, indeed, the paper that was mentioned a moment ago is an update of a book that I wrote on the politics of carbon pricing, published 5 years ago, that came through a Wilson Center fellowship when I was here as a policy fellow at the Canada Institute. And that experience really forced me to think beyond American boundaries and think about the comparative and international dimensions of this issue. And of course, when we think about carbon pricing, there's the economic story, the strong economics argument that this would become and evolve into the central climate policy mitigation tool domestically and internationally, and all the reasons for that in terms of cost effectiveness and the like. And yet, such an interesting issue and question of how an idea that emerges largely from the discipline of economics collides with political context and realities. And so what is the evolution of carbon pricing domestically and internationally and its future path? Here, of course, certainly in the United States, the political stumbling blocks remain substantial, particularly when we're talking about the federal level. And this is not a new issue. We can go back to the 1990s and the failed BTU tax, the collapse of the Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade legislation more than a decade ago, and versions of carbon pricing bills that have basically been introduced into every congressional session for decades now. And even this week, the withdrawal, at least through executive branch action, of the Commonwealth of Virginia from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Multi-State Cap-and-Trade Program. Each one of those steps reflecting the political challenges of a wicked problem like climate change, where short-term engagement is hopefully leading to a long-term benefit, which is something in politics is really hard to pull off. And front-loaded costs that are visible, that are often transparent, certainly on commodities like gasoline and electricity bills, and create significant challenges, not just in the United States, but also globally, where a great many of the carbon prices that have emerged are quite modest and have many exceptions to them. At the same time, and I say this as a political scientist, not an economist, I think it's far too premature to declare the obituary of carbon pricing, even in the United States, but certainly globally. And that's really drawing from my own reflections on this over the last 4 or 5 years since the book has been out, and 4 issues that have begun to emerge, some of which have gotten some attention in the US, some of which is not. But one is the sort of asymmetries that has emerged on this. What's well known in the US is the direction that the US has chosen to go on climate policy, including the Inflation Reduction Act. But we now have 3 major carbon pricing initiatives underway: the European Union and emissions trading system, about which Dagmara knows far, far more than I, and we'll speak to in a moment. The United Kingdom piece, where even in the Brexit era, with all the divides between the UK and the European Union on issues, has been able to maintain its own version of an ETS, a carbon pricing regime. And then just across the border, Canada, which has had every reason to shirk and back away from the pan-Canadian framework adopted 5 years ago, and expanding now to move toward ultimately a goal of hitting $170 a ton Canadian by 2030 through a complex intergovernmental system that's unique to the Canadian system. We now begin to see carbon pricing emerging in ways that, when I was here last, just seemed beyond the political imagination, all of which are major trading partners. And indeed, the United States now is in a position where about 40% of its trade is with a nation or a multi-level entity that either has or is moving toward a carbon price of about $100 a ton, possibly above that. And how do we think about that? And pretty quickly then we move into an area that's rapidly transitioning from pure theory, carbon border adjustments or the creation of carbon border clubs. What do you do when there are fundamental differences in pricing, policy commitments, and the like across great nations that engage in lots of trade? This idea has been discussed largely in economics and legal scholarship. In a theoretical sense, it now becomes real. CBAM, the European Union version, some increasing discussion amongst other nations developing carbon prices, and then the unique kind of American approach to this, and open up a conversation with, say, a Senator Whitehouse, or a Senator Coons, or a Senator Kramer, or Senator Cassidy, or yesterday's introduction by Coons and Kramer of the so-called Prove It Act, Not clear where that's going to go. Is this a backdoor path to a domestic carbon price? Or is this simply using U.S. tariff power and some measure of energy intensity or carbon emissions over time to confront major trading partners, most notably China, in ways that are likely to play out and complicate trade relations that would probably be unthinkable if we would step back just 4 or 5 years ago, but is now increasingly an empirical reality. Two last items that I would highlight that I discussed in the paper is that much of the original thinking about climate policy, but particularly carbon pricing, is that if you could kind of screw up the political courage and impose a price, the most likely way you would respond to that is by returning revenue to people who paid the prices through rebates, tax cuts, or what have you. Or put the money, it was true in many of the early carbon tax experiments, such as in some of the Nordic countries, you would put it into general revenues. The shifting empirical reality is there that certainly in the last 2 years, the number of nations adopting some form of a carbon price, linking that money to some kind of energy transition, energy efficiency, renewable energy support, coastal adaptation is on the increase. For the last 2 years, for the first time, the majority of carbon pricing revenues being generated globally are not being applied to revenue returns, rebates, that sort of thing. It's being applied to that direct transition. This opens up all kinds of questions of earmarking, hypothecated taxes, what is in the public imagination, how aware is the public, how do constituencies form, but we are increasingly seeing empirically around the world, and even in the last 4 states, to adopt some version of cap and trade. The idea is not rebate or tax cuts, it is, as they're calling it in Washington State, cap and invest. Take all of that money, create a fund, and link that to energy transition kinds of issues. That may significantly change the way we think about carbon pricing and the political dynamics if that isn't a broader trend. Final point, as some of you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about climate policy, not from the standpoint of carbon dioxide, which has received more than 95% of the attention in published policy journal articles, social science articles, but the politics of short-lived climate pollutants. Methane, hydrofluorocarbons, which are collectively responsible for about 40% of the global warming that has already occurred and present some extraordinary opportunities for short-term action. Here, I would only note the irony. The United States is the only member of the G7 without some form of a carbon price. It is, as of now, the only member of the G7, with a methane price, and creating, through statute, part of the Inflation Reduction Act, an interesting sequence of steps through increasing royalties that had not been changed since the Woodrow Wilson era. Note I got the Woodrow Wilson name in there. Eliminating the exemption of vented and flared methane from royalty payments for the first time in American history, but with it, creating a fee structure designed to go into place to incentivize cooperation, force more rapid production of data on emissions, and link that with behavior in the regulatory arena. And then when we move to some of the other areas of short-lived climate pollutants, like hydrofluorocarbons, the U.S. is using a cap-and-trade system through the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act of 2020. In Europe, we see member states using their own version of taxes. In other arenas around the world, we're beginning to see this pricing issue move forward on issues like methane, in some ways more rapidly than carbon. And ironically, when I was here several years ago, that really wasn't on political agendas. It has moved very, very rapidly, but only note that when we talk about the kind of political economy of climate, it's not just carbon. And this question of methane, and even the sorts of issues that I've been mentioning, how is the revenue used? How is it linked with other policy tools, and is that complementary or contradictory to one another? Do we begin to even look at something like methane border adjustments over time, given the substantial differences in methane emissions records from nation to nation, basin to basin, and the like? All of which then opens up issues of how all this ultimately fits together and the significance or centrality, or perhaps the less salient role of carbon pricing going forward, to which I now turn things over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Dagmara, do you want to pick up from there?
Of course. That's a perfect place to pick up, and I'm also delighted to be with you this morning. Thank you for having me. This is indeed a good moment. The mic is not on. Let me see. What about now? So once again, many thanks for being here. Also to our virtual audience that I know is here from both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you for being with us. I think it's a perfect place for me to take over from Barry. And indeed, we have been meeting on a number of conversations on CBAM carbon pricing over the past months quite regularly. I would start with the premise that the climate policies overall across the globe, but specifically also in the European Union, have proven to be remarkably robust over the last months and over a year of rocky times, or even up to 3 years if you consider the pandemic. Indeed, as a result of the war, the climate policies have become a means for us to address our strategic issues and also historic dependencies. Today, yes. Today, we are in a situation in which the law that was passed in Europe will cover 75% of emissions of EU economy by carbon pricing. Imagine that, 75% of the economy is covered by carbon pricing in the European Union. The key pieces of legislation, the Fit for 55, and that's not low-impact yoga for people overaged, but it is indeed our set of laws that we presented 2 years ago to implement our ambition to lower greenhouse gases emission by 55% by 2030. These legislative pieces have moved through the legislative process over those 2 past years, in fact, actually without any issues, and we've been doing that against a backdrop of post-pandemic recovery, inflation, war, climate crisis, and also energy crisis. All of those were at display in the European Union while we were dealing with those increased ambitions. And in fact, the increase of the ambition is quite staggering if you look at it. So if we are to increase our ambition to 55% greenhouse gases emissions by 2030, we have to limit emissions from the ETS-covered sectors. These are industries, heavy industries, and power sector. We're going up from 43 to 62% of emissions reductions in less than a decade. When it comes to yearly emissions reductions, this means for us doubling of the rate. So from 2.2% to up to 4.4% starting in 2028. So you see, these are extremely ambitious goals. And indeed, what we did not only do, increase ambition on existing EU ETS, we have expanded ETS, or carbon pricing rather. We've created a second carbon pricing regime for buildings and road transport. So I think that is the context against which we should be discussing climate policies today, definitely across the globe, but also in the European Union. Well, what that shows you is, and this is my second message to you today, that there is trust in carbon pricing. There is trust in carbon pricing in Europe. There is also emerging trust and increasing trust among our trading partners in carbon pricing. We know that this is a policy instrument that works. We in the European Union have experience already with almost 2 decades of carbon pricing. Our carbon pricing system was in 2005. 3 main achievements of that carbon pricing system we've observed. It delivers tangible emission reductions. We've grown our economy by 60%, reduced our emissions by 30% since 1990. It delivers revenues, to Barry's point, and those revenues, in fact, help us transition. Just today, the European Commission unveiled 2.4 billion euros in funding for modernization of our let's say, countries in the Central and Eastern Europe that have the highest burden to transition away from fossil fuels. So you see 2.4 billion of euros that will go to those economies that need it most, that need to have a really fair and just transition. And then thirdly, it delivers certainty for investors. It delivers a carbon price signal. It delivers a signal towards innovations and investments in technologies. And what industries have been always telling us over the past more than a decade. We need that. And Europe, where it is today with around 90 euro dollars price of ton of CO2, this is not where it's always been. We have been redesigning and we have been improving the design of our carbon pricing system so that we are here today where we are. Now, my third message to you today, and before I will go into a little bit more of the carbon pricing, carbon border mechanism that I think most of you are very interested in, is that the carbon pricing policies alone will not do the trick. It is clear that this is only part of the solution, and this is, has to be seen against the background of policies across all sectors of the economy. The whole economy needs to decarbonize, and carbon pricing helps substantially, but it will not alone do the trick. The transition is multifaceted. And so, of course, what you hear from Europe and from elsewhere is energy policy, agriculture policy, transportation policy, social policy, industrial policy, and even foreign and trade policy. So now maybe a few words about the CBAM, the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is a charge that will be applicable, but not just yet, and should be mirroring carbon pricing inside the European Union. It's one instrument, as I already said, in a bucket of policy measures and across different sectors. And what's CBAM, the reason why CBAM came into force is, in fact, there are both domestic as well as international considerations that were at play. Domestically, of course, it helped us to ratchet up the ambition because CBAM protects from carbon leakage. We have carbon leakage protections right now in the EU ETS, but as we ratchet up the ambition, those protections will not have been sufficient. So it helps us essentially for our domestic constituents to be able to say, you know, we will not lose competitiveness while we transition away from fossil fuels and we will transition towards carbon neutrality by 2050. But there are obviously also the international considerations at play. One of them is, of course, that we believe in carbon pricing. And so there are design elements in CBAM that, in fact, incentivize adoption of a scheme potentially linking up to EU CBAM, but also acceptance of other carbon pricing schemes. Those will be taken into account when charges are supposed to be applied. And then, of course, we hope to incentivize countries overall to introduce, and companies, but countries to come up with ambitious climate policies that will tangibly lead to reducing emissions in those CBAM covered sectors. And so maybe we can change to the next slide. And this are the second slide is about the sectors that are covered. Of course, the scope is sectorial, limited to the ones that you see on the screen. But also I wanted to mention that, of course, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are covered. And the charge will be applied on companies. So carbon embedded in goods is what we are after. We are not, we are policy ambivalent. So we are not, implying or applying that charge on countries, but on producers, on importers of goods, of those goods into the European Union. Now, when we move to the next slide, I would like to say a few words about the CBAM implementation, and that is really a careful, predictable, and proportionate transition that we are after. Why? Because exactly what I said before, we know that such instruments that are novel, that are unprecedented, like CBAM is, but also like ETS was, EU ETS was, they require transition periods, careful considerations, moments in time in the future that we will be able to revisit the design and really adjust to what the reality will be on the ground. So you see the transition phase. First, just to say that there's going to be a monitoring and reporting during the first, let's say, October to end of December 2025, and the charge only applies from 1st of January 2026. We will in 2025, already in 2025, so before we even charge anything at the border, we will be looking at what we've learned from the data that we've been assembling, and that's quite key. And last but not least, when we phase in CBAM, we will be synchronously phasing out free allocations. And that's important as well, because that moment in time when the full CBAM charge is applicable, this is only going to be in 2034, according to the design as it stands right now. So I think with that, I pass it back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you for giving us the rundown. I will come back to you with some questions. I think it's a topic that many people are interested in. I think it'd be great to go to Stefano next to talk a little bit about some of the other areas where we're seeing carbon markets grow. We've got a good introduction of markets in Europe and I think some of the more established, but it'd be great to hear a little bit about how other countries, I know China launched its own carbon market a few years ago, are developing. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. And thanks again for the invite to be here. I just wanted to say thank you to the Transatlantic Climate Bridge Initiative, the Wilson Center, Adelphi, and all the organizers. And also thank you to Dagmara and Barry for the excellent remarks that really helped set the stage for the discussion. As Sarah anticipated, I'll take it from basically where Dagmara and Barry left off, and I'll give you a quick a bit of a broader look on what is the state of play for emission trading systems worldwide. I hope you can see my slides up on the screen, or should I share my screen? Happy to do whatever it's easier.
Yeah, we can see them. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, good. And so if we go on to the second slide, just as a quick word to contextualize the discussion, ICAP, in case you're not familiar with the organization, is a forum that brings together more than 40 national and subnational governments that basically jointly get together to work on the design and implementation of emission trading systems. This is also just to say that what I will be presenting now really concerns developments in the emission trading systems space. But then again, happy to talk about carbon pricing more broadly in the discussion. If we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly take you over what we think are the key trends that are characterizing emission trading systems at the moment. So first of all, I think it's worth noting that the momentum for the development of these policy tools is continuing and is on the rise. We've done a report that maps out the state of play in emission trading systems globally for 10 years now. And over the last decade, both the number of system and the global coverage in terms of emission covered by emission trading systems more than doubled. And as we will see in a second, more systems are scheduled to come online in the coming years. Second key observation is that emission trading systems worldwide and also carbon pricing tools more broadly did weather an eventful year, and I'm talking about 2022 here, without major disruptions. And 2022, as we all know, was a year characterized by major geopolitical disruptions, by the first ever global energy crisis. And those of you that have followed the carbon pricing and emission trading systems for a number of years will know that when similar crises emerged in the past, this policy tool did suffer to some extent, whereas this time around, most emission trading systems did have additional stability measures built into them, which did allow them to react really positively to the energy crisis and to basically weather the storm with no disruptions. But we'll get that later on in the presentation. And if we look at price levels, carbon prices did make significant gain in 2021. And over the last year, they basically more or less stagnated around the same price levels, despite having some fluctuations over the year, and being stable at a relatively high level. They also raised a record level of revenues from auctionings, and again, we'll go into this a bit more in detail later on in the presentation. But moving on to the next slide, we can quickly see what is the state of play as of today for the implementation of emission trading systems globally. There are 29 systems in force as of today, with about 20 more at different stages of development or considerations around the world. One thing notice on this map is that emission trading systems really do span the globe. Again, if we were to look at this map 10 years ago, it would have looked way more empty, and most of the systems were clustered in OECD countries, whereas now systems are being implemented, designed, or considered also in developing countries and emerging economies. Again, just for reference, if we were to look at carbon pricing more broadly, we would be at more than twice the number. I think there are now just over 70 carbon pricing initiatives implemented around the world, and the map would obviously be even more colored out. And again, we could spend hours dissecting different systems, and I'd be more than happy to come back to some of these later on in the discussion if there is interest from panelists or participants. But this was really just to complement what Barry and Dagmara said in terms of global implementation and show where we are with that. On the next slide, we also see how that basically evolved over time. So here we see the global emissions that are under an ETS cap, so the global coverage of emission trading systems, and we can really see how over the last 15 years or so that expanded over time with new systems coming online almost every year. It all started back in 2005 when the EU ETS was launched, and since then emission trading systems did come online again almost every year, bringing the global total to 29 and bringing the global total of emissions covered by an ETS to roughly 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, if we were to take other forms of carbon pricing into consideration, that would be roughly 25% of global emissions. So that is obviously a quarter of global emissions that are covered by one form of carbon pricing or the other. Moving on to the next slide, we can also see how the sectors covered by emission trading systems can vary. Typically, these systems tend to cover the power sector and the industrial sector, because those are sectors that are particularly well suited to be covered by carbon pricing in general and by emission trading systems more specifically, because they do have relatively low marginal abatement costs compared to other sectors, and they also tend to have a few large emitting sources, so they're particularly well suited to be covered by this type of policies. But over time, and in different places around the world, systems were either designed from the outset, or they were expanded in subsequent phases to also cover additional sectors. So as you can see from the graph on the slide, we do have examples of emission trading systems that cover building and transport, for example, that cover domestic aviation, or that cover the waste sector, for example, or in some cases even forestry and parts of the agriculture sector. In the EU, the ETS will be expanded in the coming years to also include the maritime sector, which will also come on the graph in a few years down the line. And the EU has also designed a second ETS separate from the first one that will cover the building and transport sector, for example. On to the next slide, I will quickly show you how allowance prices in these systems have evolved over time. On the left-hand side of the slide, you will see prices from 2008 to 2022, and then the right-hand side of the slide is a zoom into last year, so a zoom into 2022. And we will see that even though prices have remained at a relatively low level for many years, in the ETS, for example, we almost had a decade of low prices following the 2008 global financial crisis. Prices did start to recover across the board and in many different systems over the last 3 to 4 years. And again, as I said in the introduction, they remained stable over the course of 2022, despite having a global energy crisis that did provide some fluctuation in prices, as you would expect from a market-based policy tool. We did have variations in prices, but across the board, in almost every systems, allowance prices did open and close the year around the same price levels. If we were to look a bit beyond that, prices started to rise again in some systems in 2023. And for example, they broke the record ceiling of 100 euros a ton in the ETS a couple of months ago. On to the last slide in the presentation, I wanted to also say a few words about the flip side of having high prices, which is the record level of revenues that emission trading systems have been collecting over the last couple of years. Dagmara and Barry already touched on this, but the ability of raising auction revenues is a key characteristic of and a key feature of emission trading systems. The global total since auctioning first started is more than 220 billion of the US dollars raised in revenues since 2008. But more than half of that has been raised in the last couple of years alone. So in 2021 and 2022, and 2022 most notably was again a record year with more than 60 billion of US dollars of revenues collected globally. The increasing trend is mainly because of raising prices, as you might imagine, but also as a result of an increasing use of auctioning as opposed to free allocation in more and more systems around the world. I'll keep it here in the interest of time. On the next slide, you will find more resources and publications that are available on the ICAP website. So I'll encourage you to have a look there in case you want to dig a bit deeper into the world of emission trading systems. With that, the floor goes back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was a great overview. And finally, I'll turn it over to Jessica I think she's going to speak to some of the linkages in carbon markets, and I think give us a broad overview of some other of the issues we haven't already hit upon yet. So over to you.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
I'm going to assume
great.
That's a yes. And you're going to pull up my my PowerPoint there?
We can see them. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thanks so much. I thought I would do a sort of soft orange here as a recognition of the smoke that many of us are living with right now, which I think brings the urgency of the effectiveness of carbon pricing to the fore. So I'd like to, if you could go to the next slide, I'd like to start with a quote from my esteemed colleague who we heard from first. In his great book, Can We Price Carbon? He says, compelling ideas from economics do not necessarily suspend the laws of politics. And so I'd like to talk about the laws of politics today. I think this quote really encapsulates a lot of my work on carbon pricing. I think another way to put this in perspective is that the World Bank now estimates that a quarter of global emissions is regulated by a carbon price. That doesn't include the recent expansion that Dagmara referenced. So 1/4 of global emissions is regulated by a carbon price, and yet greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow. So the gap between policy and outcomes is real. And I'd like to examine why we see those gaps. Okay, on to the next slide. Just briefly, who am I and why am I talking about this? I'm a political scientist. I'm an academic. I'm American, but have been living in Canada for 5 years. And my work is on the history of carbon markets and carbon accounting and the role of non-state actors in global climate governance. And I wrote a book, which you can see there. And I'm working on a new book called The Existential Politics of Climate Change. And some of the work, some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today are part of this work that I'm doing right now. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, going back to Barry's quote, I want to talk about two compelling ideas. First, and this is something that we're going to, I think, I would expect to see more and more of as carbon markets and carbon pricing instruments expand, that linking jurisdictions with carbon pricing can help create a global market or a more global market to accelerate emissions reduction. And second, carbon offsets can redistribute wealth and achieve emissions reductions where the marginal costs of doing so are lowest. So we have a win-win of investing in carbon emissions reductions and maximizing economic efficiency. So let's look at the first compelling idea of linkage. On the next slide, linkage looks great on paper. So let me first say what that means. Countries face different political and economic constraints, as we know. So the idea here is we let countries set their carbon pricing or other climate policies unilaterally, and then link those together, not unlike the CBAM that Dagmara was describing. And these linkages can be direct or they can be indirect. And I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but let me just give you two examples. The simplest version is a two-way linking between jurisdictions. So for example, California and Quebec now have a two-way direct linkage. So the allowances in each of those markets are accepted in the other ones. There can be indirect linkages. So for example, let's say the EU ETS and the New Zealand ETS both use carbon offset or CERs, carbon offsets from the Clean Development Mechanism. So they are indirectly linked through the Clean Development Mechanism. Okay, so the idea here is, following economic theory, you have a bigger market that lowers costs, it creates greater liquidity and perhaps greater resilience against shocks. And then if you have lower costs, you can have greater ambition because it's cheaper to reduce, so you can do more. And Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 in general relies on market mechanisms, but 6.2 embraces or sort of puts forward this idea of linkage through the notion of cooperative approaches that involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes toward nationally determined contributions. Internationally transferred mitigation outcomes are ITMOs. And the basic idea here is that linkage, usually bilateral linkage, can help achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So this is going to be, it has been and is going to continue to be an important thing going forward. If we go to the next slide, there are political challenges in practice, right? So different levels of ambition. So that's kind of the appeal, is this flexibility. But if there's an over allocation of allowances, as was, say, the case in the pilot phase of the EU ETS and arguably after, this would have a ripple effect on other markets and potentially drive down prices and potentially drive down environmental effectiveness. And this could happen if compliance becomes too costly. It doesn't have to be an over allocation in the beginning, but if a government changes its cap for whatever reason, this would obviously have ripple effects. There's a loss of regulatory autonomy. So to the extent that you link between markets, you have to harmonize standards, you have to make sure that monitoring and verification are adequate in all of the markets to ensure the sort of validity of these assets. So that's going to impact your autonomy, your sovereignty. It's not entirely clear how you delink if you change your mind. We did it in Ontario. Our Conservative Premier, Doug Ford, pulled out of the market between Quebec. It had been between Quebec, Ontario, and California. We did it, but it cost $3 billion because we had to buy back all of the allowances that were still in circulation. And then, of course, there are potential for huge transfers of wealth, right? And that could become politically contentious. And I want to talk about one thing here, which links, I think, to Barry's earlier comments about short-lived pollutants, HFCs. Some of you may know, the deep wonks among you will know about HFC projects that were part of the CBAM in China and to a lesser extent in Mexico. HFCs are an extremely potent greenhouse gas, 11,700 times more global warming potential than CO2. So under the rules of the CBAM, every ton of which is the offset market under the Kyoto Protocol, every ton of HFC 23 that was abated is equivalent to 11,700 tons of CO2, right? So this is a cash crop, if you will. So it created an incentive for manufacturers, HCFC manufacturers, to participate in the CBAM so that they could then capture the CFCs that were produced in this industrial process. These projects were eventually eliminated as an acceptable methodology under the CBAM because they created basically a perverse incentive to create HFCs in order to capture them. Why am I telling you this? Because first of all, there were huge transfers of wealth to China in these projects, which was the political optics of that weren't great because China was becoming a major emitter at the time and now is the world's largest emitter. And it also brings me to the next slide and the next idea, which is that offsets are the other compelling idea that haven't worked out great. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, thank you. Linkage almost certainly includes offsets. So the Clean Development Mechanism, which I mentioned before, and the Paris Agreement has created the Sustainable Development Mechanism. So offsets aren't going anywhere, and they are generally part of the linkages that have been created. But offsets have serious integrity problems. So if we go to the next slide, the trouble with offsets, let's recall, this may seem basic to some of you, but it's worth thinking about because when we think about compelling ideas and how they work in practice with the laws of politics, offsets quantify and sell the hypothesized absence of emissions. And I'm not talking about permanent permanent offsets here because that's a very small market at this point. So we have to ask when we create an offset, does the offset market create a price signal which changes investment choices? Most offsets are under 15 bucks a ton. Do these investment choices then reduce emissions through the financing of a project? And how do we ensure high quality offsets? And then finally, what counts as additional in a world where we're supposed to be rapidly reducing emissions? So there's a lot of thinking, assumptions, and calculations that have to go into creating a robust offset, which is also an asset. And this is problematic. And I'm going to skip to the third point here. I highly recommend Danny Cullenward and David Victor's book, Making Climate Policy, in which they spell out how basically all of the constituencies involved in offsets have no interest in high quality offsets, right? Offsets create rents, they create special interest groups that entrench low quality offsets rather than expanding the opportunities for emission cuts. Cullen, Ward, and Victor say, quote, better outcomes are possible in theory, but there's no potent constituency that favors the reforms that are needed because everybody wants cheap offsets and they want, so those involved in the production want cheap offsets and they want to ensure an ongoing demand for them. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the next slide. So we have all of these additionality problems, leakage problems, baseline problems, and these are even worse in the voluntary market or the unregulated market. So there's a whole market that's not the clean development mechanism, that's not national offset programs that are created by non-state actors. I talk a lot about them in my book. And these are growing in importance as companies and make net zero pledges that require offsets in the short or even long term. There's been a lot of reporting in The Guardian about how many of these offsets don't represent real emissions reductions and are likely to be phantom credits. I should note that the offset market is now valued at $2 billion and is growing mightily. And one reason this is not only because of the net zero pledges, but if we go to the next slide, which is my last slide, we see that there is an increasing demand for offsets because of CORSIA, which is the offset agreement that governs aviation. And what that agreement does is it aims to cap international aviation emissions at 2020 levels by 2027. But because technology limits the ability to which this can be a low emissions technology, we have to have a lot of offsets. And that shows the projected demand for offsets based on the legislation. Now, the key component here is that offsets from the voluntary market, which I just showed you in the last slide, are now being accepted by CORSIA as compliance grade offsets. So we have, again, this linkage between an intergovernmental agreement and the voluntary or unregulated offset market, which is potentially presenting serious challenges for quality. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I will leave it there, and I could just ask that you go to the last slide where there's a little information about me. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. Super informative. We don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then I'll open it up to the floor. I'm eager to hear from everyone here and online. I would like to start with this discussion, I think, about the intersection of trade and carbon markets. I think this has gained a lot of attention, and it seems to have allowed for some bipartisan buy-in, I think, at the U.S. congressional level. And you mentioned, Barry, part of that might be because of this ability to sort of confront China and be used as a lever of competition. I'm curious how you see this conversation playing out, and maybe, Dagmar, if you want to jump in, how that would sort of impact discussions between the EU and the US over carbon markets and the ability to align approaches.
So I'll just talk about the latest American developments. And I think the age of the collision between climate policy and trade is upon us, and what that is going to look like. The only regime where we've really kind of dealt with the trade ramifications and baked it in goes back to the HFC arrangement in Kigali, and one of the things that brought all of the nations of the world, including the U.S. with legislation that passed 3 years ago into this, is the proposed cutoff of access to HFC production and distribution markets by the 2030s if you weren't on board. That, along with lots and lots of other factors, was a significant component. But when we think of the Paris Agreement or other things like it, which involve individual national pledges, we have been moving along a path of you largely do what you want to do nationally or subnationally, and then at some point, there perhaps is a reconciliation, and that collides with trade. This has been coming in the U.S. for several years. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, the extent to which there's a kind of energy nationalism built into all dimensions of that, and now a year after the adoption of that legislation, how much time the Treasury Department and other parts of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus are trying to negotiate and explain what that would mean for South Korea, for the United Kingdom, the European Union, and only last-minute efforts by Canada and Mexico to actually change some of the statute to talk about North America versus America, headed off an even deeper collision in that arena. So it's there, it's joint. And of course, the U.S. enters into this trying to bring back supply chains and manufacturing to the United States, has now seen 2 presidential administrations prepared to use tariffs in pretty aggressive ways that often will have impacts on energy, and then we move into this new element and component. I think it's largely uncharted territory, but it's been fascinating to watch developments in the Senate over the last year or more, different interpretations and versions of this, but clearly I think, Sarah, what you're talking about, the broader sentiments here, it's certainly reflected in the new legislation that seems to have a bipartisan basis of support, would, like the EU, take some time and measure, but focus mainly on carbon intensity. Try to figure out what that means, how you would measure it, and then think about trade issues and trade ramifications, with the possibility then that in a year or 2 down the road, where that analysis be in place, the U.S. would begin to levy or consider levying tariffs, not on the basis of carbon pricing or climate policy or other kinds of commitments, but some measure of the efficiency with which manufacturing and other key industries operate. Now, that's very attractive from a domestic policy perspective. The international dimensions or multinational dimensions of this become problematic, just as the Inflation Reduction Act is often seen differently in Washington as opposed to other national capitals. And this gets attention. Don't think that there's any clear direction or momentum, but it's also interesting if you look at the rhetoric of many of the principals coming into leadership roles on this on both sides of the aisle. They still do tend to speak very, very differently about not just the study of carbon intensity, but what this would mean, how it would play out, and how we even begin to think about these issues. The last point I'll just note is that the kind of indifference to sort of traditional trade rules in the World Trade Organization is really quite interesting. And, to what extent do nations kind of go rogue or consider going rogue and worrying less about trade compliance and other kinds of things and kind of reinvent trade in this era. So I think this is part of a larger set of conversations we're going to be having on the intersection of these things.
Thanks. I think, Dagmar, I'd be curious what your perspective is. The European Union has been working on its carbon border adjustment mechanism for quite some time. There's been some criticism, I think, that it is protectionist. I think there are countries, India is considering taking it to the WTO. How do you address that criticism and think about, the U.S. is clearly trying to find a way to price carbon without putting a price on it. Is there a way that those 2 systems can find some type of coherence?
Thank you, Sarah. So I will again kind of pick up where Barry left. I think trade is, from the point of view of the European Union, really key to enable the clean energy transition and the transition towards climate neutrality. And therefore, we, in our design, definitely put a lot of emphasis on making CBAM and our approach WTO compatible. So you will hear us speak about that. And this is not only to, let's say, protect us from those WTO potential, cases. We do feel that we have consulted extensively and really done a very deep and in-depth analysis on the legal, let's say, part of the CBAM being non-discriminatory. I think what's important is that we have a carbon price within, and our industry is exposed to it. What we're trying to do is just level the playing field, right? Like whatever goods, and we are a big market. So whatever goods are get imported into the European Union, we want to make sure that those producers, those importers, are simply treated exactly the same as if they were producing within the European Union. And that tells you one thing. We are part of the global system, and we want to be part of that global system, that trade system. We are, in fact, intensely negotiating free trade agreements with a number of partners across the globe right now. And those free trade agreements have very important climate components going forward. And we hope that there will be developments from those trade agreements, but also from other policies within the European Union, which all of them essentially are consistent with each other and are mutually supportive. So, when we speak about CBAM, we definitely see that as an opportunity to partner up with countries. What we do is, and what we've been doing, CBAM has been, let's say, in discussions for the last 3 years. It has been proposed as part of the European Green Deal already in December 2019, if you recall. So over those years, I mean, I cannot tell you how intensely I was engaging here in the United States, but we all across the globe, in EU delegations across the globe, were exactly tasked with that, with that thing, to engage with our partners in order to make sure that there are no misconceptions, there are no misrepresentations, and that we can work together to essentially advance our shared objective, namely reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So I think that is key, and that engagement will continue. Those methodologies that I spoke about, for instance, colleagues just told me yesterday evening that some of those will be probably already put forward for consultation as early as today or maybe on Monday. So you see, so that is a process for us, an interactive process with stakeholders, partners. Now on the EU-US, of course, we have a specific conversation on the global steel and aluminium arrangement, and that will be the first test case for us to be able to, despite our, let's say, policy differences in terms of how we approach tackling climate change. We are aligned on the objective, but our approaches are different. And again, I said that CBAM is, let's say, does not really penalize a country, right? It doesn't, it only incentivizes carbon pricing, but doesn't penalize if you don't have a carbon pricing, right? So I think the deal that we are now very hard negotiating and will be probably unveiled towards the second part of this year, that will show, I hope, everyone that we will be able to work together on those hard to abate sectors.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of those negotiations. Stefano, I had a question for you. I know when China launched its carbon market, it was set to be the largest in the world, and I noticed from one of your slides, the price has really not budged much since that happened. Can you talk about the evolution of some of these other markets? And are there some that you think are particularly interesting and maybe evolving in a way that might be notable?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I think you're right. So China is pretty much still in a setup phase. Implementing an emission trading system in a country that is as big as China and has that kind of emission profile. It's not a trivial exercise. China experimented for almost a decade with the regional pilot systems, and then a couple of years ago did launch a national system that so far only covers the power sector. And again, it is in operation, but the system is still being refined as they go. And I think that to some extent explains why why you see low prices at the moment in the system. It's quite common for emission trading systems to start, relatively slow and with low prices, and then policymakers tend to reform them over time and to make them a bit more biting over time, and that gives time to both the ETS regulator and covered entities to learn how to deal with the system before prices start to go up. We've seen that in many different systems. What's interesting in China is that because it is in China, and also because of the design that the system has taken, it could provide an interesting blueprint for system design in emerging economies and developing countries. It is China was the first non-OECD country to go ahead with the implementation of an emission trading systems, and still now other countries in the Southeast Asia region and beyond that are looking at the progress that China is making with their system in the context of considering or developing systems in their countries. I think it could be some sort of an example for other emerging economies that are planning to follow suit, and those could be Indonesia, for example, India, and also countries in Latin America.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to put my last question to Jessica. I think the debate around offsets and voluntary carbon markets has gained a lot of attention lately. I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on that. You said, offsets is a compelling idea that hasn't worked out. Where do you see this going?
I want to just follow up quickly. That's a great question on what Stefano said about exporting the Chinese model to other emerging economies. I just want to note that it takes an extraordinary amount of technical capacity to set up a carbon market. And even the EU ETS, which has, arguably the most likely case, right, because it has so much capacity and political will, has taken quite some time to do that. So I think we should expect that this is a very big project. Onto offsets. So I think that, first of all, I don't think we should call it the voluntary market. I think we should call it the unregulated market because it is unregulated, and it's clear that there is a huge amount of, there are a huge number of bogus credits circulating, and everybody sort of the math all lines up, but it's very unclear that the reductions actually do. And so I think that, and we know that there's a very strong, like these voluntary offset providers, they are a strong political constituency. They lobbied hard to make sure that they were included in the Corsia agreement over time. And we see that there's some recognition of some of the major credits in offset credits in other compliance markets. I think they need to be regulated by governments, for starters. And I think we need to eliminate a lot of different kinds of offsets, not least of which are the red offsets or the rainforest offsets. We need to distinguish between permanent offsets and avoided emissions. Really, we should only be working on permanent offsets at this point. Avoided emissions is like, first of all, really difficult to measure, prone to gaming, and is not the game right now. I mean, the game, what counts as additional in a world where we need to get to, net zero by 2050? Like those baselines need to be changing a lot, right? What we consider to be an additional reduction compared to quote unquote business as usual needs to be these very difficult to abate emissions and nothing else. And the offset market hasn't kept pace with that. So I think we need to regulate it. We need to cut out a lot of the different kinds of allowable offsets. We need to distinguish between permanent and avoided emissions. And the idea, we're setting this up for recreation through the Paris Agreement in Article 6.4, which is the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is sort of the redux of the CDM. And it's not clear to me that any of the lessons that we learned from the CDM, including a lot of the mistakes that were made, are going to be prevented in this new reincarnation. So I'm very wary of that new mechanism. I think we just need to, wean ourselves off of offsets, because it really is just for the most part, kicking the can down the road.
I'm glad you mentioned Article 6.4 and this mechanism. I am curious what your perception is around removals. I mean, this has become a big part of the discussion. I think it raised a lot more attention than the members of this supervisory body on 6.4 were anticipating. Where do you think removals fit in this conversation? I'm curious where you see that conversation headed.
Removals are important. I mean, we need them, right? I mean, if you read the latest Working Group 3 report, right, that all of the models include removals, right? So we need them. But the problem is that there's no demand for them because they're too expensive. Why would you pay, I think Carbon Plan has done this costing. I think it's like $1,000 a ton for carbon removals when you could buy rainforest offsets for $10 a ton. I mean, only the leaders like Stripe and Microsoft are investing in this. And so there's no demand because there's no regulation. So why would you pay for the Lamborghini when you could, buy I don't want to name check some much more inexpensive model, right? So I think that we need to move on this, but it's not going to happen. We can't rely on sort of leaders and visionaries and rich corporations to pave the way. There needs to be more put into the R&D and cultivating the demand for those offsets.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. Actually, sorry, Stefan, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to follow up on what Jessica said on removals, because I agree with her. I mean, it's a bit of uncharted territory. They're going to be really needed. To reach net zero, the net of net zero will be removals, because we will have to net out any residual emissions that we will have in 2050. And one really interesting question is where the demand for removals will come from, and how we will get to the level of removals that will be needed in 2050 to offset whatever residual emissions we will have. And from that point of view, I think an interesting thing to consider is the potential integration between removal credits and compliance carbon pricing systems, because from that point of view, we need removals. The demand will need to come from somewhere. And quite simply, the two choices are either governments will, put in place purchasing programs for the removals, and they will be funded by a state budget, or somehow the obligation to create that demand will be imposed on businesses and covered entities. And one way to do that would be by including a removal obligations in compliance carbon pricing systems, which will then effectively become systems to balance out residual emissions and removals. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting sort of conversation. I'm eager to see how it develops, especially as this panel comes to putting forward some recommendations this year. So I don't know if either of you have additional comments?
Just on the removals, because indeed, I think we feel from the European Union perspective that we have to kind of be really, again, charting a little uncharted territory. So I think, Stefano, you know very well that we've put forward a proposal on certifying removals, and it is, again, a very novel approach. We hope that through that certification, we will create markets, essentially, and demand. And so there could be, going forward, some interesting developments in the European Union to watch around that. But I think the proposal came out only last year, so it has to go through the legislation process. And again, it's novel, so it might be, as this develops, needs to be adapted to those developments. But very eager to watch that space, and also invite you all to watch that space.
Great. Pro tip. Thank you. I will now open it up to the floor. If anyone in the room has questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. I think you're close. Some of you are close to mics, and we can hear from you. Any questions?
Yeah, hello. My name is Charlotte Unger. I'm from Potsdam, Germany, actually, just staying for a couple of months, and I'm from the Research Institute for Sustainability there. And thank you, first of all, very much for this very interesting discussion. I think there were several very relevant points made here. My question or my interest is really on CBAM at the moment, so I was very interested in learning or in hearing your points, Dagmara. And so my question would be, you've spoken you've said some words on how the EU at the moment is negotiating free trade agreements with several partner countries. And you've mentioned especially the negotiations on this potential agreement on steel. And I was wondering what that actually means for the CBAM. How would this potentially connect to this CBAM? So, for example, if the EU and the US came up with some sort of standards or tariffs, would it be possible then to, well, how would that be accounted for under the CBAM? Would you have, for example, some exemptions, or is there any thoughts on that already? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a very pertinent question, and I can tell you that this is at the very core of the current discussions between the EU and US. Now, I think a clear, red line and expectation from our side is that whatever we do, CBAM stands. So there, and we don't, it's a legislation. It's already written in law, and there are no exemptions for individual negotiations under the law, and so there will need to be another compromise that we will need to find. But I think the key word here is carbon embedded in those products, right? So we want to find equivalency in approaching the carbon embedded in products there.
Does that answer your question? Okay. I see a hand back here. Yes.
Just building on that question, Dan Thompson.
Sorry, can you, yeah. Yeah, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Thanks. Dan Thompson with U.S. Trade Representative. So building on that, Robert Habeck, the economy and environmental minister in Germany on Wednesday, he signaled a great tension between the ambition of climate action and capacity. And these headwinds are growing stronger, actually. So we need to move capital, we need to move investment very rapidly to start addressing the technologies that are needed right now before voters withdraw their support for some of these initiatives. The steel industry in Europe has said they cannot modernize without massive investments in green technology, which means the European Union is going to, or the institutions of the European Union, others are going to have to come up with the funding to do that. How will the European Union ensure these subsidies will not distort global markets, that they'll be fair to U.S. steel industries that have modernized on their own with their own capital? And is there a way to harmonize the U.S. IRA approach, which gives customers, puts customers in charge of creating the demand signal, consumers, versus the EU approach, which uses, the tax system to redistribute and recycle funds into subsidy programs to support the modernization of certain industries. And there are concerns in Europe that redistribution is going to large companies, not to small and medium enterprises. So how do you reconcile that, both at a political economy level and at a global markets level? What are some of the thinking on those two issues?
I think this is really a very, very complicated question to answer in a few words. I think with the IRA here in the United States, of course, there was a lot of concerns that would be like a race to the top in terms of subsidies. Within the European Union, we also have to consider that not all governments have exactly the same capacity within the 27 to be able to subsidize, specific parts of the industry that let's say, subsidy most in order to be able to essentially weather the transition. So I think we have, let's say, domestically a set of problems or a set of issues that we'll need to address. Of course, transatlantically, there is the question of, is the IRA siphoning out investments from Europe because it is offering such a, let's say, open-ended, it is such an open-ended scheme. There's not a top, number that is, so to say, topping off the level of subsidies available. So if there's demand, the money almost seems abundant, right? So I think, what you see, that the policymakers, how they try to address it is, first of all, that we have to, that this has to be a win-win. It has to be as much as possible coordinated. We need to be, and so there is this discussion under the TTC, under the Trade and Technology Council on transparency of our subsidy schemes so that we can create those win-win opportunities and that we can, as much as possible, avert any effects on the perverse effects on essentially on subsidy race types of outcomes. And now the funding question for us still obviously involves a number of acts that we have laid forward. We've seen earlier this year maybe on the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan with 2 additional pieces of legislation that are now going through the co-legislation process in Europe. So I think the jury is still out how we're going to tackle the question of what sorts of funding will be available to whom. Now, you see already a number of things that are in place. The big instrument that we have to support the innovation, of course, apart from Horizon Europe, which is the research and innovation, early research support that we give, is the Innovation Fund under the EU ETS. And there, again, because the money from the allowances feeds into that system, the higher the price, the more money, more funding there is for innovation. One element that we notice is, for instance, for aviation, sustainable aviation fuel. Those are very expensive still. We are very, let's say, aggressively in a sense, trying to also decarbonize aviation. There will be money, to be able to let's say, support the developments of sustainable aviation fuels. So you see, so there are a number of developments already in place, but a lot of political discussion that will be still happening. And let's not forget, next year is again a year of elections in Europe with the European Parliament and then the new Commission coming into place. There is a lot of discussion about 2040 targets already starting right now in Europe. What is it that what is the carbon budget? What is it that we have to do going forward? So still extremely intense, I think, times on climate policy in Europe, like literally very, very intense going forward. We are not resting on our laurels here.
Any other questions from the room before we wrap up? I'm actually going to throw one more in before I do kind of a round of closing remarks from everyone. I'm curious about, Barry, you kicked off by mentioning the revenue-raising potential of carbon markets and how that has been beneficial in some ways, helping some areas transition their energy systems, also going to low-income communities. There are various ways this money is being put to use. And I open this to everyone. Last year, around the time of the climate talks, Secretary Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, also mentioned an idea of some type of framework that would allow for offsets to raise revenue to help developing countries transition their economies to clean energy. So I'm curious when this revenue raising effort works and when we should be cautious of the approach. I think it's an interesting element of these systems.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And it's really an interesting question. I think most of the focus on these issues have been within the nation or the jurisdiction that raises the funds what is a fair and just allocation. So we get into environmental justice conversations in the U.S. Sigmar, you mentioned the Innovation Fund and how that's playing across the European Union. But then this does raise the other issue. We're seeing very little appetite from carbon pricing funds that are being used to then shift those funds outside that nation or outside those jurisdictions, particularly for emerging economies for whom there is not a clear plan for transition to alternative energies or thinking about funding transitions, and in some cases for whom possible production of oil and gas is a potentially attractive alternative without access to those sorts of transitions. So I think this is yet another one of these huge areas that's rarely discussed. You in your reporting have talked about this a great deal, which I appreciate, but is an enormous challenge as we think about nations beginning to come together and kind of collide over the terms of trade, environment, and what that's going to look like. But under what circumstances is then their sharing of that revenue or sharing with technology or any others with nations that are just going to be lagging behind, and given what we know about climate change, are already facing the greatest threat and are going to be facing the greatest threats going forward. So it's a huge issue.
Stefano or Jessica, did either of you have comments on that? I know it comes up in sort of both of your work.
I'll add quickly, but I think what Barry said pretty much covers it. I think it's a really, it tends to be like a jurisdiction-specific discussion, and there are different ways and examples that we can look at when it comes to optimal ways to reinvest the revenues generated by carbon pricing. But the model that works best really depends on the local circumstances of each jurisdictions. And if you look at examples, you'll find examples that range all the way from some jurisdictions recycling or channeling 100% of the revenues to the general budget, because that is the model that works for them. And at the other end of the spectrum, you do have some systems that earmarked 100% of the auction revenues and then channel them to either supporting consumers or supporting covered entities, or to financing emission reduction projects outside of the system boundary. And again, there's evidence that different things can be done, but the right recipe depends on the local circumstances, I think.
I'll just jump in real quick here. I think the revenue question is a really important one. I want to emphasize what Barry said about the justice implications. I also want to point out that there are better tools than carbon pricing to raise revenue for an energy transition. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago that said that tax reform is climate policy. Corporations offshore their profits. A conservative estimate suggests that incurs $500 million in losses per year to government and tax revenue. So if we want to raise money for the energy transition, there are better ways to do it.
Thank you.
Maybe just a word from me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the financing from CBAM, the revenues that would be created was part of the negotiations, of course, also when CBAM was being passed. And so this element is not, there's no earmarking from the CBAM revenues towards the least developed countries. But this is one element when we are going to be looking at CBAM and revising and looking whether or not it needs to be revised going forward. This is one element that the co-legislators agreed that needs to be looked into. What's the impact on the least developed countries, and how can this be addressed? So I would just want to recall that, of course, on climate finance, the EU is the largest donor of climate finance internationally, but that doesn't mean that we, again, here rest on our laurels. I think we really very actively pursue, engagement with the least developed countries, but also with other developing countries to support them on their transition with capacity building and other issues. So that's an important element for the co-legislators and will be followed up on in the future.
And we have just about a minute left, but I'd love to just give everyone the floor for a final thought, a chance to plug your next project, maybe what you're working on at the moment, a book, anything along those lines. Maybe just a final thought to close this out. I'll start with you, Barry.
I would just underscore the need to think not just about the carbon pieces, but the other greenhouse gases, where different policy tools do or do not work. And I take away from this conversation just how challenging many of these areas are. Offsets, linkage, how do you include removals, et cetera, trade. Just to begin to put in legislation and agency redesign and deal with all of these issues are just all enormous challenges, whether it's a market-based policy, a pricing policy, or any other kind of a system.
I would like to end on a note looking back, because I'm soon going to be in the United States. I will have been for 5 years. And so I would like to note that the conversation has changed remarkably over the past years. And so we should acknowledge that, and that's on the optimistic note. And I'm glad we have the challenge that we are having, and that I'm glad that we are talking about these matters, and I'm glad that people are realizing this needs to be addressed. It wasn't the case 5 years ago. Thank you.
Jessica, final thought?
This has been a really rich and interesting discussion, so thanks to everyone. I guess I would just say kind of there is a huge amount of complexity here. I think we started, 25 years ago thinking, a carbon price was the way to solve climate change, and we now see that even when we just limit ourselves to this one tool of carbon pricing, that there are huge complexities around it. It requires an enormous amount of technical capacity and political will. And so I think the challenge is really to think about ways to channel investment to build that political will. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
And maybe just quickly building on what Jessica said, I think, again, we could probably spend hours talking about what the right carbon pricing instrument, or more broadly, what kind of climate change instrument is the best one to reduce emissions. But I think, one key consideration that we have to keep in mind is that regardless of the instrument we choose, we do need to raise the level of ambition. As Jessica also pointed out earlier, only 25% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing, and global emissions are still on the rise. So it's obvious that what we are doing is not sufficient. So on one hand, a key discussion that needs to happen is around how we raise the level of ambition and how we make these instruments more effective. And at the same time, a parallel discussion needs to happen around how we build and then maintain support in society for the implementation of these issues. Because without constantly building support for green transition and for carbon pricing and for the fight against climate change, any instrument that you pick will have a short lifespan, and that is the last thing that we need right now.
Wonderful. I will echo Jessica in saying that this has been a really rich conversation. It's been my pleasure to moderate the discussion with all of you. I hope to have more of these discussions in the future, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.